comes a new challenger!
Alexander the Greatest here, and we're back with another deck profile. This time it's Ahri the Nine-Tailed Fox. The objective of this deck is fairly simple. You're looking to develop small creatures early and use them to score points, and then use larger units in the late game to try to close out. As a general strategy, you're not looking to spend a lot of power in the early game for this deck, and that's because you're trying to get to those bombs as fast as possible. So you try to spend as little as possible, try to kind of interact with your opponent while not really slowing yourself down. You do play a little bit of ramp as well to kind of help you get there, and then in the late game, you're going to try to use your bombs and possibly your time warp to actually close out the game. So without further ado, let's get right into it. First, we're going to talk about the legend itself. The thing I actually like most about this deck is the domain combination. It's not actually the legend. Now, the legend's effect is decent, giving -1 might to any unit that enters a battlefield you control, and this will work across multiple units. But oftentimes I feel this is a little bit worse than Yi's effect as a whole. But I really like the domain combination. This effect is not a blank by any means. It is still a very powerful legend effect. It's just a little lackluster in comparison to some of the other ones that are out there right now. Another issue I have with this deck is that both of the chosen champion options are a little weak right now, in my opinion. That in combination with the legend's slightly underpowered effect, I think keeps this deck from reaching its true greatness, but it is still a very good deck. So we'll get right into it. So first we have 6 comm runes, 6 mind runes. So we're not spending very much power in the early game, as I mentioned, or at least we're trying not to. So we have an even split here, as we don't really intend to spend much power early on. And the power that we do need early on, or might need early on, is pretty split. So we're gonna take the even split on that. Next, we'll get into the battlefield. So first up, we've got the Dreaming Tree. If you've been following the meta a lot recently, the Dreaming Tree right now is one of the most popular and powerful battlefields. And with this deck, it's no exception. This is typically going to be your game 1 battlefield. You're going to use this pretty much everywhere game 1, especially against Kaisa, where they're probably also going to use a Dreaming Tree game 1. So you're going to be able to kind of double dip there. So even if you do go second, you'll still be able to move a unit into the unoccupied battlefield ideally, and be able to start kind of triggering your draws and kind of cycling through your deck. A lot of this deck is just trying to use your counters and buffs, kind of like Master Yi, to defend those little units and try to score some amount of points and hold down those battlefields until you're actually able to play your bigger units. And the Dreaming Tree really helps with this. This is your most powerful game, is when the Dreaming Tree is out, because it just fuels this whole draw engine. Overall, it's just a very solid battlefield. I would say it's probably the best in the game right now. Next up, we have Grove of the God Willow. You're going to use this on the game where you do go first. So it's very good going first, because you are going to be able to be the first person to move into this battlefield typically. And then you'll be able to do so holding energy up, so you'll be able to defend your unit in there and try to trigger draws. You still want to be drawing cards, even though the Dreaming Tree is missing. You want some sort of pseudo draw engine. You're not really going to use this much when you go second, because then your opponent gets to abuse it better in the same manner that I just described, where they'll just get into it first and then they can defend their unit there. So this is definitely your go first battlefield. Finally, we have Trifarian Warcamp. Trifarian Warcamp is going to be the battlefield that we choose when we are going second. The other ones are just significantly better when we are going first. Trifarian Warcamp is also the battlefield that easily could be another hold battlefield of choice. Whether you want to draw one or get a rune for hold, either of these are a perfectly acceptable replacement. I went with Trifarian Warcamp because I like the way that it interacts with removal spells. When you have some of your units in the battlefield, they become harder to remove with specific damage-based removals. It also interacts in an interesting way with your legend, where the buff of the Trifarian Warcamp actually applies before the debuff of your Ahri legend. So why this is beneficial is against specifically 1 might units, which wouldn't actually be able to get the reduction from your Ahri they will still see them get that buff and then get the reduction from the Ahri, leaving their unit without the buff, and any units you might have there will still receive the buff. This is beneficial when your opponent might be using something like tokens or other low might units to actually attack the point that you're in. It also messes with the math of some of the damage-based removables. For example, your Ahri champion, which I mentioned earlier, is susceptible to being killed by one instance of Falling Star, or a Hextech Ray can no longer be killed by those while in this battlefield. So for our chosen champion, we have Ahri Inquisitive. And the reason we've gone with Ahri Inquisitive over the other Ahri chosen champion, which many of these decks are playing right now, is for a couple reasons. The first one is that this Ahri is a 3 energy unit. And why I think this is important is, especially when going second, it is essential that you do not miss a turn 1 unit play. And this kind of helps shore up and guarantee that if you go second, you'll always be able to make a play. And even when you go first on your turn 2, you're also not trying to miss a turn 2 unit play. And this card just guarantees that you're not going to miss on that, because it's very important to be able to hold the battlefields early in this deck where you're trying to score points. This is also just a very solid card, giving any unit that attacks or defends against -2 might, which is huge. So in a way, she's kind of effectively like a 5 if she's fighting against any unit that she can get the full -2 might against. I think that's really important, just having such a big unit. Now, there are a few downsides to this one. One, obviously, it doesn't have the score the extra point effect like the other one does, which synergizes very well with the Time Walk. The other is that it does cost a power early, and like I said, we're not really trying to spend power early. If you had to make the decision between spending the power early or not playing a card altogether, oftentimes you will just opt to play the card instead. Now, sometimes you won't need to play this on turn 2 because you'd rather just leave all your energy up because you already have a guy and you'd like to be able to defend that with your spells. But this does still allow for a good option. It also, when you play her, you will still have 1 energy up, so you might be able to play a Defy, a Stupefy, or an On Guard, which is pretty helpful. The third downside to her is that she does die to many of the removals, especially in Kaisa, that are currently in format. So for example, this can get Falling Starred with just one of the Falling Star triggers. This can be Hextech Raid. So 3 is right under that important breaking point, so she is vulnerable to a lot of those spells. But again, it's really important that in this deck that you don't miss unit drops on curve. Next, we'll start with the units. The objective of the units in this deck is usually just to play the highest quality units, and there's not a whole lot available for 2s in this color that are super high quality. So we're playing the 3 best ones. The first is Stalwart Poro. Stalwart Poro is just big, and that's kind of what you want. It works kind of in combination with the Ahri Effectus too, so he's effectively getting that extra might when he's defending, which is very important. Also, if he has to defend against extra units, he's getting even more of a might bump because those units all get minused by Ahri's effect. Next up, we have Ravenbloom Student. Again, this deck just has a lot of cheap spells, and Ravenbloom Student synergizes very well with cheap spells, especially ones at reaction or action speed, because she is getting the buff and able to kind of defend those battlefields early on. This is just a very, very solid 2-drop, and one that you will see in most Mind decks. And finally, we have Clockwork Keeper. Clockwork Keeper is just a 2 might, 2 cost that has the option of drawing a card. We're almost never going to do this early. It's more for when you draw this in the late game, this guy can replace himself. So one downside to 2s is oftentimes they are bricks when you draw them in the late game or you don't want to see them, but this one can easily replace itself, especially in the late game when we're going to have access to a lot of power. Next up, we have Lecturing Yordle, a solid 3 energy unit. It just draws a card to replace itself. Again, a lot of what we're trying to do is drawing cards, which is a big deal in this deck, just keeping your hand presence up, being able to find those reactions to help protect your early game units. It has tank as well too, so if it has to go into a battlefield with another unit, it can kind of soak up that damage, especially when you pair it with some of your bigger units where you might be fighting a bigger unit and this tanking 2 can actually keep your bigger units like the Watcher and Fey Folk alive. Next, we're going to hop right into the bomb units. This curve is just very low and then jumps right up. A lot of what this deck is trying to do, like we said, is just kind of either doing some ramp in the early game or just drawing cards and defending these smaller units until we can get to the big units. So you get into these relatively quick, especially since we're not spending a lot of power. So first up, we have Thousand-Tailed Watcher. This is just hands down pretty much the best unit in the game. An absolute solid finisher. You're going to see this in every Mind deck out there. I can't imagine not playing this unit in any Mind deck right now. Just a very, very solid guy. He's a great finisher. He's got Accelerate. He's very good, especially against the Yi decks, where you need to break into battlefields, and they often have larger units defending those battlefields. And as you can see, a lot of your early units are much smaller. You don't play any mid-game units that are often girthier to help you kind of break into those battlefields, and Thousand-Tailed Watcher does exactly that. Next up, we have Tasty Fey Folk. This is kind of part of that ramp package and another Accelerate unit. The reason we're so filled with these Accelerate units is because we are a little slower in the early game. We are trying to defend ourselves, but what happens when we can't defend these battlefields? What happens when we don't draw enough buff spells or we have to take a turn off to ramp? Well, that's kind of where Tasty Fey Folk comes in. Tasty Fey Folk has Accelerate and can kind of get into those battlefields immediately, and it's a card your opponent absolutely hates to kill. Just, you get 2 runes and you draw a card, and it's gonna kind of keep that ramp up so that you can keep casting these bombs every turn in the late game and just keep putting the pressure on them. Finally, for the units, we have White Flame Protector. This very easily could have been Mega Mech, and I do still have Mega Mech in the sideboard. I'll discuss that in a moment. The reason I'm opting for White Flame Protector is sometimes this deck can struggle against the Yi decks, even the Aurora ones, and I decided to take a little bit of hedge with Yi being one of the most popular decks right now, and play this instead, because this really helps you get into battlefields versus the Yis. Now, I mentioned earlier, you have a lot of early game small units, but the same thing with Tasty Fey Folk. What happens when you couldn't defend those battlefields early? How do you get back in? And a White Flame Protector is the ultimate solution to this problem. White Flame Protector giving the +8 just allows any of your small 2 might units to just break right in. It'll give them a base 10 minimum, and it also develops an 8 body, so on the following turn, you can actually use this to break in as well. Again, if I thought I was going to see like a lot of Kaisa, this card is still fine versus Kaisa, but you don't really need the pump, but he's still a solid 8 body. The only downside is he does cost 2 power to play him. So if you're not ramping, or you didn't have like a very ramp intensive game, or you had to spend power earlier, maybe you didn't see a Tasty Fey Folk, this card is very power intensive, which is not always what you're looking to do against something like Kaisa. It costs 8 instead of Mega Mech, which costs 7. So Mega Mech can often come a turn earlier, especially if you're going second. So this is still fine versus Kaisa, but I would probably put Mega Mech in instead. I just wanted the upside versus Yi in my game ones, so I kept the White Flame Protector in the main, and it's really been great. Next, let's get into the spells. First up, we have Defy. This is pretty much a staple counter spell. It's in pretty much every comm deck to date. This card just helps protect your units in the early game, especially when you're trying to use buff spells to help keep them alive, especially against removals. It is just a very, very solid spell. And it's one of the reasons I actually like being in these domains is, like I said earlier, Calm Mind is one of the best domain combinations in my opinion right now, and Defy is part of what makes that so great. Having access to this 1 energy counter is just so powerful, especially in a deck like this that plays all the buffs as well. Next up, we have Stupefy. Stupefy is one of the best combat tricks in the game, and that is kind of exacerbated by the Dreaming Tree. In game 1, the main function of this Stupefy is actually going to be to target your own unit on the Dreaming Tree to draw 2. The minus is largely irrelevant because you'll do it after you've already captured the battlefield, so you don't need to worry about losing the fight or having your opponent interact positively with some sort of removal spell. You're really just using this to draw 2 and filter to your other buffs, your creatures, your big bombs, whatever you need at the time. But it also doubles as a combat trick when you need to. So if you need that 1 extra might to win the fight, you can certainly use it for that as well. In game 2s, you're often going to side some number of this card out once the Dreaming Tree is gone, because it is much less effective in those scenarios, and its main upside is just being a 1 energy draw 2. Next up, you have On Guard. This is just your basic buff spell. Again, early game, we're just looking to use buff spells to help our units score points and kind of keep them alive and protect them. We're looking to make way for our bombs to come in and kind of close out the game. On Guard is especially powerful game 1 when you do have the Dreaming Tree, so it is going to replace itself. And even when you have the Grove of the God Willow out, so you can actually hold that battlefield and hopefully draw a card there as well. Next up, we have Retreat. Retreat is one of the mentioned ways that this deck is able to ramp. It also synergizes with the Dreaming Tree, allowing you to draw and protect your early units. You need a way to protect your units and keep them alive, especially since there are so few of them, and you want to be able to keep them alive in case you were to potentially lose a fight, or you need to send them back to your hand to keep them alive so you can replay them on the following turn. Again, it has a ton of utility in this deck. You're looking to ramp, you're looking to preserve your early units, and you're looking to draw with the Dreaming Tree, and this card does all 3 of those things. Next up, we have Charm. Charm is the single most powerful spell in this deck, and probably the single best calm card in the game. This card is just incredible. It is your best removal. It synergizes very well with Ahri's effect, much like Yi. When you pull guys into your battlefield, they're going to get the -1 from Ahri. And in the early game, it's very good for slowing your opponent down. In the late game, it's very good for making use of your bombs as removal. It's just a very, very solid card overall. You're not really looking to use this much in the early game unless you're playing against more aggressive decks. Sometimes you will use it against Kaisa, but like I said, we're not looking to spend very much power, so you need to be careful with using this early on, only if you absolutely need to. You also don't want to have something disastrous happen where you try to use this against Kaisa and they have a removal spell and then they kill your guy in the battlefield, and they can even score a point off of that if they win. So you just need to be careful using this early. Most of the time I like to use this once we're kind of set up and we've got all our runes out, or at least a good 9 or 10 out. I like to start firing these off and just kind of cleaning up the board and simplifying the board state. Next up, we have Discipline. Discipline is just On Guard on steroids. It does the same exact thing, except you don't have to have only one guy in the battlefield if you don't want to get the max buff. It draws a card, and then if you have the Dreaming Tree, it draws another card. So this is a lot of time going to function just as a 2 mana draw 2. Sometimes you're even going to just play this when the buff doesn't matter. So you're going to get a guy into the Dreaming Tree battlefield, and you're just going to opt to draw 2 for 2. And it really is just good enough to do that. It's going to synergize well also with cards like Charm. It's just another combat trick. Effectively, like I said, it is just a better On Guard. Next, we have Find Your Center. Find Your Center is one of the ramp cards in this deck. Now, I only played 2. I really couldn't fit the 3rd, and it is very solid. But I could not find room for the 3rd, and I liked Retreat a little bit better as far as ramp spells go, because it does have that synergy with the Dreaming Tree to draw a card, and it is always much cheaper. Now, this does draw a card, but it costs 3 in the early game. It is nice that it's action speed, so what you can do with it is if you play a unit on turn 1, on turn 2 you can actually leave all your energy up, and if it doesn't look like your opponent's going to try to challenge your battlefield, you can actually play this if they move into the other battlefield to get the ramp then and draw the card, while still holding up in case they do decide to try to fight you and you need to play buffs or denies or retreats or whatever you got going on. So it does have that utility in the late game when your opponent is 3 points away from victory. It does cost 1, so it just kind of turns into like almost like a cheap cantrip in the late game if you don't see it. It does keep churning out those runes. Overall, just like a very, very solid card. I wish I could fit 3, but I really couldn't find the space. The deck is very, very tight. And finally, a One of Time Warp. Most of the decks you'll see that are playing Ahri are playing 2 or 3 of this right now. My objective with this deck is not to constantly try to Time Warp my opponent out of the game. And you could side a second one of this, but I've found that I am pretty successful in winning the game without the Time Warp, actually. Now, if you wanted to bump this to 2, again, that's fine. I don't see an issue. I thought 3 was a little clunky, especially in the games where you didn't have the Dreaming Tree, because oftentimes you didn't draw nearly as much. And it makes this card a lot more bricky in your hand, especially when you draw multiples. So if you have a hand of 6 cards and you drew 2 of these, you really only have a hand of 4 cards until you're actually ready to use this and go and win the game. I still think this card is great here. I'm also not playing the Chosen Champion Ahri that scores you the extra point, because I'm not trying to really win with the Time Warp combo necessarily. I'm more trying to just win through slamming bombs every single turn over and over again, and using those to kind of break into battlefields, and then using my powerful spells to kind of carry the rest of the distance. But I still think this is worth including in the deck. I still do think it's a solid card here. Like, you can put the second one in. It could even easily have been in the side. I just was liking 1 because I wanted the extra space, so I went with the 1 instead. Next, we'll go over the sideboard. First up, we have 3 Zhonya's Hourglass. And this is a card I would have liked to fit in the main, and you can fit in the main if you think you're going to run into a very Kaisa-heavy meta. That's where I think this card kind of shines, and why it's really in here is for the Kaisa deck. Your general strategy against a Kaisa deck is kind of going to be, you play some guys early, you try to score some points, but really you're trying as hard as possible to kind of just ramp up and start playing these bombs. Kaisa has a hard time against larger units, especially in the battlefield, so Zhonya's Hourglass being able to keep saving these larger units whenever possible is going to be a big part of your objective versus them. Now, you need to be careful though, because if you do play a unit early, or you play Zhonya's Hourglass with the unit on board, that they don't kill that other unit, because Zhonya's Hourglass will be forced to trigger, and you don't want that to happen. You want this to trigger on your big units like your Watcher, your Fey Folk, your White Flame Protector. But that is one of the best strategies versus Kaisa, is just using this to keep those bigger units alive. A lot of times you can even set this. That's probably one of the best applications, is once you get a big guy out, and especially if it's like a Tasty Fey Folk or a Watcher, and you accelerate them into the battlefield, you then set the Zhonya's Hourglass to protect it, and then once it dies, you just bring it back and you just attack all over again. And they have to keep fighting through these larger units, on top of all the buffs and interaction spells that you possess in your deck, which is very, very difficult at times for Kaisa to do. Next up, we have Megamech. This is just a slightly better version of White Flame Protector versus Kaisa. While they don't do exactly the same thing, most of Kaisa's units that are going to be in the battlefield are a bit smaller, so the pump from White Flame Protector is not always necessary. Granted, White Flame Protector is a little faster, so if they do leave a lot of resources up, and you're afraid they're going to use removal spells or combat trick spells to try to defend that battlefield, White Flame Protector does kind of give you that buff so you can attack immediately. Megamech, however, is 1 energy cheaper and doesn't cost any power, and it's really relevant when you go second, because you can get it down a turn early if you don't see any of that ramp. It's massive too, the same size as White Flame Protector. It's just a card that I would side in for the White Flame Protectors when I'm playing against Kaisa. It very easily could have been in the main, but like I said with the White Flame Protector, I wanted to hedge in the main board a little bit more against the decks. Next up, we have Unchecked Power. This is not a card you see too often in sideboards, but it's a card I've been testing a lot recently, and I've really liked it against the Aurora and the bigger Yi decks. It's very good where these Aurora decks are trying to stack up guys in the battlefield and kind of make it so you can't break through. This kind of puts them in a damned if they do, damned if they don't situation with the White Flame Protectors, whereas if they only leave one guy in the battlefield, you can use the White Flame Protectors to kind of try to push your way through, and if they want to stack up, now they're actually losing to Unchecked Power. It's kind of a great way to kind of board wipe them down. It also does not actually choose anything, so if they have something like Dead Bloom Predator in the battlefield, you don't actually have to pay that deflect cost, which is really nice. Overall, it's just a very solid card against these Aurora decks, and creates a scenario where if they stack up, they all die. There's not really too many units in this game that can get above 12 might, even with the buffs. Now, the downside is that it does exhaust all of your units, so you can't attack with anything that turn, but that's fine against them. You're really just trying to kind of reset the board, and then even if they get another unit out on the following turn with their Aurora, it's not going to be able to move into a battlefield most of the time, so you'll have a turn to actually get in there and score points, and then maybe potentially use your Time Warp to close out the game. Overall, it's just a very solid card and one that I've had a lot of success with in testing. And then finally, the third White Flame Protector. This is just to shore up even more against the Aurora and the E decks, just giving you a third copy of this. Overall, just a very, very solid card, and having a third copy is just going to assist you in those matchups. Now let's talk a little bit about the matchups. So first up, we'll talk about Kaisa. Kaisa is certainly one of your more difficult matchups, and I'm not going to advertise this deck as a deck that consistently beats Kaisa by any means. Kaisa is the best deck for a reason. This Ahri deck is, by my opinion, it's a tier 2 deck and a good one, but it's not as good as Kaisa. So if you're coming here and hoping for me to tell you that you're going to have a favored matchup in the Kaisa, unfortunately, I can't say that. However, you're not just down and out. I will say it feels very favored going first against Kaisa, as many decks often can. I do think you have a lot of tempo and you want to play more aggressively against Kaisa. You do want to save this power. As I mentioned earlier, your general strategy versus them is going to be to try to score some points early with early aggression and kind of defend your units using your defies, your combat tricks, etc., and try to score some points early, and then try to accelerate out a Tasty Faith Folk or a Watcher in the late game, and try to set a Zonias to protect that. So even if they kill it, you can kind of just keep pushing into those battlefields and just continually put the pressure on them. Tasty Faith Folk is great too, because even if they do manage to kill it, you still get those 2 runes and the draw to kind of just keep going and just keep the pressure on them. This is a real struggle going second. I will say you are really, really going to struggle versus Kaisa going second. We do have the sideboard in the form of the Mega Mech, but it is going to be a very uphill battle. My advice is still kind of the same there. You're still trying to score points early and defend your guys. Maybe a little bit more emphasis on ramp so you can get to the bomb, Zonia's Hourglass, a little bit faster and try to close out the game with the Time Warp. And this is where you can consider possibly playing the extra Time Warp, but I still do think that 1 is fine. One thing you have to be concerned with too in the early game is oftentimes you do need to leave up to be able to play around the Falling Star. So if you're going to play 2 guys out, make sure you have a buff spell. Remember that Defy can't actually hit the Falling Star because it does have a 2 power cost, even if Kaisa pays for it. So you're going to want something like On Guard or Discipline to actually be able to protect your units from their Falling Star early. It can be a massive blowout if they do manage to Falling Star and kill 2 of your guys with it. Next up, we have Master Yi. I'm going to just talk about the mid-range version, and then I'll talk about the Aurora version when I discuss Aurora. This deck feels very good to me into Master Yi. You're a very similar deck. You're playing buffs. You're playing these interactions. You do have a lot of similar cards, but one thing that you have that they do not in the late game is the Thousand-Tailed Watcher, which pretty much allows you to break into any battlefield you want, even with the Yi buff. He's extremely powerful for closing the game when you both kind of function in a similar manner, and this is why the White Flame Protector is here. He's going to be your go-to bomb in the late game to let you kind of break into those reinforced battlefields, especially when they get some of the bigger units like the Dead Bloom Predator in there that are a 10, and you can't really fight with just a single unit. Even Thousand-Tailed Watcher can only trade the Dead Bloom by itself, so White Flame Protector actually allows you to kind of upgrade any of your units into a trade with it at the very least, and then it also develops an 8 might unit, so that on the next turn you can actually start attacking with that as well. Like I said, you're a very similar deck to them. Your Legend does something very similar. They do have a better champion than you, which is unfortunate, but there's not much you can do about that. But you do have the Thousand-Tailed Watcher, which I think is a huge difference maker here. You also have the Time Warp, so if you are able to successfully get into those battlefields and seal the game with Time Warp, you can win that way as well. Retreat does give you the option to ramp. While they have some ramp options themselves, I do like Retreat here a lot because it does synergize with the Dreaming Tree. Sometimes they might even have the Dreaming Tree themselves, and you can actually play off of that. But I feel very good about this into Yi because of the Fox and because of how much this deck actually draws. I do think you have a lot of ways to like keep your draws going in this deck and kind of get to all the gas you need. But this is very similar to Yi. So keep that in mind when playing against them. They're going to have a lot of the same cards that you do. Next, we'll talk about Aurora. Aurora is very similar to Yi. White Flame Protector and Thousand Tailed Watcher are kind of going to be your money makers there, where you're going to use those to break into their larger reinforced battlefields and kind of try to break through that. Sometimes it can be a little bit of an RNG fest. Now, if they do go first and they play turn 3 Aurora, which I believe is about a 13%er if I'm not mistaken, it is going to be a very, very uphill battle for you. It is going to be a struggle. When they don't see that Aurora on turn 3 going first or going second, even like a turn 4 one going second is very manageable. And again, you do have some amount of sideboard for them. The unchecked power is really good. That's the main card there for them, the White Flame Protector, to help you kind of keep those buffs up. And you can bring in the Zhonya's Hourglass too if you would like, kind of just keep big units on your board. So if they do break back into those battlefields, you can kind of push right on through. I will say I feel a lot better about the Yi version than the MF version. The MF version has the Mind Splitter, which can just make your life an absolute nightmare by ripping your key cards out of your hand, whether that's Unchecked Power, whether that's White Flame Protector. The only other downside to Unchecked Power is that it is a non-unit, so if they are siding the Sabotages in, which they more than likely are, they can actually rip this out of your hand, which can be annoying. The Time Warp can also be used to kind of seal up the games there. Against the Aurora decks, it's very important that you don't miss early units, and that's kind of where this Ahri comes up, is because if you go second, you can guarantee that you always have a turn 1 play, or if you go first, you can guarantee that you always have a turn 2 play, provided you didn't draw 2 of them. Now, some people argue that the score an extra 0.1 is going to be better versus the Aurora because of the fact that you are going to probably get that hold off. And while that is sometimes true, I actually find sometimes this one is a little bit better because that extra might you get is super important. One thing you can actually do with this is, so let's say you play a 2 on turn 1 and you move into a battlefield. You can actually play this Ahri into that battlefield, and just alone with any of your 2s at a baseline, this is actually going to trade with the Deadbloom Predator. It's going to be, your unit's going to be a 2 base. She's going to be 3, that's 5. They're going to get -2 from this, and then they're going to get -1 for an Ahri for a total of 8. So this will trade a Deadbloom. With the Stalwart Poro, you'll actually beat the Deadbloom, so one of these will survive. And then with a buff, you can definitely beat the Deadbloom Predator. So that's also where this Ahri is really important for when they miss that Aurora and they have to play the Deadbloom Predator, and you can kind of get them pretty bad right there with this Ahri. So that's why I like this a little bit better than the other one. Whereas with the other one, they can't actually just hop in with the Deadbloom Predator and win the fight if you don't have any sort of interaction. It also can't be played going second on turn 1, which is a huge downside in my opinion. Next up, I'll talk a little bit about the Sett matchup. I'll admit, while I was testing this deck, I don't have as many reps versus Sett as I do the other ones. Now, I did play a good amount versus Sett, just not as many as I did versus the previous 3 mentioned decks. A big one versus Sett, though, is going to be, again, Fox, White Flame Protector. If they're just trying to keep guys on the battlefields and sort of keep them alive, the Ahri champion unit is also very good there. Sett is a deck that you're going to try to stuff a lot of units into the battlefield against, because they oftentimes now are trying to stuff a lot of guys into one battlefield. Sometimes they have to attack you with multiple units to actually break in, because they're not a deck that breaks into battlefields super well all the time, and that's where your Ahri Legend is going to kind of get its value by kind of dropping down the stats on all of those units that Sett tries to attack you with. And then if they do try to attack you with just one, you do have a lot of defense to kind of hold off in a similar manner that you do versus Yi. When they do take those battlefields, you're going to use the Thousand Tailed Watcher and the White Flame Protector to kind of break in. These guys are pretty much universal in every matchup. Their highest use cases are going to be against every deck except Kaisa, because Kaisa is going to defend their battlefields more with their spells than they are their units, whereas most of these other decks are going to defend their battlefields with their units and not their spells, and that's where the White Flame Protector and Thousand Tailed Watcher come up better in those scenarios. Now, the White Flame Protector obviously still buffs your units, but against decks like Sett, there's not a whole lot of combat tricks. You do need to be wary of Hidden Blade, so if you do White Flame Protector and target one of your smaller units, don't invest everything in that guy trying to win the battlefield. Sometimes you want to send in multiple units, especially if they have a hidden card set, because you don't want to run into a situation where, okay, I'm banking it all on this 1,000-tailed watcher, or I'm banking it all on this 10-power clockwork keeper, and then they play the hidden blade and your whole plan is kind of down the drain. You're really just trying to get big guys into the battlefields and kind of hold them and even stuff the battlefields versus them, so they have a hard time actually breaking back in there, and then using your combat tricks to hold against them. If you also see their strategies to stuff multiple units into a battlefield to hold them, this is where you can side unchecked power against them, and they'll kind of wipe all those battlefields out, minus the one guy that they decide to save with Sett. But the deck does take a very long time to rebuild their board, so when you kind of wipe them out all but one creature, it is hard to win. Something you do need to be conscious of is Judgment. Most of these Sett decks now are playing Judgment, and Judgment can absolutely wipe you out. Because you are a deck that is trying to accumulate a massive hand, especially with the Dreaming Tree and Ramp Up, if they get a good board, just 2 units that have buffs on them, like a Sett, a Fiora, whatever, and you haven't established a bomb yet, they can easily just Judgment you, and that will almost always end the game on the spot. So it is imperative that you try to get a big unit down as fast as possible, so at least that if they do Judgment you, you have something big already on the board that you can actually use to fight against them. At that point, you feel pretty good because most of your buff spells and early spells are very cheap. So after they Judgment you, you'll have 4 energy on the next turn, which you can then use your buff spells, maybe your Defies to try to counter any potential hidden blades and kind of protect your one big guy as he keeps forcing his way into battlefields and just running over whatever they had left after the Judgment. Finally, we have aggro decks. These are decks like Darius, Annie, Jinx. We're not seeing a lot of these decks right now. And the strategy versus them is pretty similar to Kaisa, where you're going to try to just play some guys in the early game, maybe defend them, try to hold them off scoring those early points. But what you really want to do is just get a big guy in your battlefield and keep protecting it with Zhonya's Hourglass and try to make their life as miserable as possible breaking through, and then potentially finish out with a Time Walk. Charm is going to be very big there. Those are matchups where you might play Charm in the early game too, just to kind of control their board a little bit and kind of keep that board presence to a minimum wherever you can. And that's our Ahri deck profile. Make sure to check us out on Metafy. We're going to be having a full free Ahri guide later this week to go along with this video. We've also got plenty of other guides there as well for you. Until next time, guys.
Challenger TCG now has a Metafy.
Wow.
If you would like to support our content so we can continue doing what we are doing, then please consider subscribing to any of our Metafy tiers. Not only will you be supporting more content like this, but you will also gain access to our community Discord, where we do live streams, Riftbound product giveaways, host VODs of our competitive testing sessions, and offer one-on-one coaching sessions. The members of our team are seasoned veterans of the competitive TCG world and have seen multiple successes across a variety of games. We also have written deck guide content available for free right now, and will be providing additional guides at no cost in the future. So check us out, even if you can't subscribe, if you are looking for high-quality competitive content.